Okay, this is number 22 on the homework, page 113. And before we do number 22, I want to go back over some strategies that I've worked with my class that could be helpful. So we'll see. So strategies. The blue point I have at the top says, don't begin a proof by stating two angles are congruent, or stating two angles are supplementary, or even two angles are complementary, because there's nowhere to go from there. Normally, if you start off a proof by saying, whatever, angle A is congruent to angle B, and then you try to go somewhere, there's nothing to do. So I don't like starting with that. You can. These strategies are all things that I think make proofs less confusing. And really, if you don't do them, I think it makes proofs more confusing. Red says when you prove two angles or segments are congruent, try to use the transitive property in your next step. So try to use the transitive property as soon as you can. Purple says when you prove two angles are supplementary or complementary, try to use the congruent complements or supplements theorem. And then green, which is many times done first in a proof, is to say look for vertical angles or linear pairs in your diagram. So you can use those just like your givens. So instead of starting your proof with a given, you can start your proof by identifying your pair. For example, angle 1 and 2 are vertical angles. And you use your definition as your reason. So let's take a look. There's only those four strategies. I think my class we analyzed the proofs we were doing and said there's really only these four strategies that we can pay attention to be helpful. So number 22 says angle 1 and angle 3 are complementary, and angle 2 and angle 4 are complementary, and we want to prove two angles are congruent. Now, you see complementary, you see congruent, and you even see vertical angles in your proof. So those are the things we're going to have to work with. We have complementary, we have congruent, maybe we have vertical angles. Let's take a look at our proof reference sheet. All right, vertical angles. We know vertical angles are congruent. Okay, complementary angles. They sum up to 90 degrees. It's not useful most of the time. The congruent complements theorem says if two angles are complementary to the same angle, and then this big parentheses, or two congruent angles, then they are congruent. So the congruent complements theorem says the word congruent and it says the word complementary. If I look at my proof, I have the words complementary and I have the words congruent. It's like this giant sign telling you, use the congruent complements theorem, because the wording that is in the theorem is literally on your paper, complementary and congruent. So let's look at that theorem again. It says if two angles are complementary to the same angle, they're congruent to each other. In case you don't really remember what that looks like, it's like if I have angle 1 and angle 2 are complementary, and I have angle 1 and angle 3 are complementary. If angle 1 is 100 degrees, that's not possible for complementary. It's doing supplementary there. If angle 1 is 40 degrees, then angle 2 has to be 50. And since we said angle 1 is 40 degrees, angle 3 also has to be 50. So angle 2 and angle 3 are the same. That's the congruent complements theorem. If two angles are complementary to the same angle, then those two angles are congruent to each other. But the theorem also has that pink underline part, if they're complementary to two angles that are congruent to each other. So here, if instead of saying they're both complementary to angle 1, they're actually complementary to two different angles, but those two angles are congruent, they're both 40s, then the two angles I'm talking about have to both be 50s. So let's go back and look at this. We have 1 and 3 complementary and 2 and 4 complementary, and we have vertical angles. Vertical angles lead to the angles being congruent. So they're actually going to use the congruent complements theorem with that pink underline part. I can't show that 1 and 2 are complementary to the same angle, or 3 and 4 are complementary to the same angle, but I can show that they're complementary to congruent angles. So I can start by saying complementary, but that's not useful, like then what? So I'm actually going to start by saying this instead. Angle 2 and 3 are vertical angles. My reason is the definition of vertical angles. The definition of vertical angles tells you what they look like, helps you identify them. Once I know they're vertical, I know that they're congruent. Angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. That's the vertical angle congruence theorem. You can use your proof reference sheet to help you check both of those things. Definition of vertical angles: two angles whose sides form pairs of opposite rays. Technical definition, which tells you to identify them. Then my theorem itself says if two angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. So that's the vertical angle congruence theorem. So I know angle 2 and angle 3 are congruent. I know that 1 and 3 are complementary and 2 and 4 are complementary. In other words, 1 is complementary to an angle that's congruent, that 4 is also complementary to. 2 and 3 are the same size. If 2 and 3 are both 40 degrees, 1 and 4 have to be 50. So I'm going to state both of my givens now. 1 and 3 are complementary. Let's see, so statement number 3. Angle 1 and angle 3 are complementary. And I'm actually going to state them both here. Angle 2 and angle 4 are complementary. I don't normally list both the givens at the same time, but the theorem that I'm about to use literally uses that. And so now I just use the congruent complements theorem. Because of all this information, angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. Congruent complements theorem. Again, the congruent complements theorem stated that if two angles, 1 and 4, are complementary to the same angle, which they're not, or are complementary to congruent angles, 2 and 3 are congruent, then those two angles, 1 and 4, must be congruent. That's the wording of the theorem. Again, in pink, if two angles, angles 1 and 4, are complementary to the same angle, which they're not, or if they are complementary to congruent angles, like 2 and 3, those are congruent, we already showed that, then those two angles, 1 and 4, are congruent themselves. And so your proof is done. If I go back to my strategies, once I prove two angles are supplementary or complementary, or once I prove two angles are congruent, try to use your congruent complements theorem. Try to use your congruent supplements theorem. So that's it for number 22. Watch the video a couple times until that makes sense.